You know, if you take people, and I've told you this, and you expose them voluntarily to things that they are avoiding and are afraid of, you know, that they know they need to overcome in order to meet their goals, their self-defined goals. If you can teach people to stand up in the face of the things they're afraid of, they get stronger. And you don't know what the upper limits to that are, because you might ask yourself, like, if for 10 years, if you didn't avoid doing what you knew you needed to do, by your own definitions, right, within the value structure that you've created to the degree that you've done that, what would you be like? Well, you know, there are remarkable people who come into the world from time to time, and there are people who do find out over decades-long periods what they could be like if they were who they were, if they spoke their being forward. And they get stronger and stronger and stronger, and we don't know the limits to that. We do not know the limits to that. And so you could say, well, in part, perhaps the reason that you're suffering unbearably can be left at your feet, because you're not everything you could be, and you know it. And of course, that's a terrible thing to admit, and it's a terrible thing to consider, but there's real promise in it, right? Because it means that perhaps there's another way that you could look at the world, and another way that you could act in the world, so what it would reflect back to you would be much better than what it reflects back to you now. And then the second part of that is, well, imagine that many people did that, because we've done a lot as human beings. We've done a lot of remarkable things, and I've told you already, I think before, that today, for example, about 250,000 people will be lifted out of abject poverty, and about 300,000 people attached to the electrical power grid. We're lifting people out of poverty collectively at a faster rate that's ever occurred in the history of humankind by a huge margin. And that's been going on unbelievably quickly since the year 2000. The UN had planned to have poverty between 2000 and 2015, and it was accomplished by 2013. So there's inequality developing in many places, and you hear lots of political agitation about that. But overall, the tide is lifting everyone up, and that's a great thing, and we have no idea how fast we could multiply that if people got their act together and really aimed at it. Because, you know, my experience is with people that we're probably running at about 51% of our capacity. I mean, you can think about this yourselves. I often ask undergraduates how many hours a day you waste, or how many hours a week you waste, and the classic answer is something like 4 to 6 hours a day. You know, inefficient studying, watching things on YouTube that not only do you not want to watch, that you don't even care about, that make you feel horrible about watching after you're done. That's probably 4 hours right there. You know, you think, well, that's 25 hours a week, it's 100 hours a month, that's 2.5 full work weeks, it's half a year of work weeks per year. And if your time is worth $20 an hour, which is a radical underestimate, it's probably more like 50 if you think about it in terms of deferred wages. If you're wasting 20 hours a week, you're wasting $50,000 a year. And you are doing that right now. And it's because you're young, wasting $50,000 a year is a way bigger catastrophe than it would be for me to waste it, because I'm not going to last nearly as long. And so if your life isn't everything it could be, you could ask yourself, well, what would happen if you just stopped wasting the opportunities that are in front of you? You'd be, who knows how much more efficient? 10 times more efficient, 20 times more efficient. That's the Pareto distribution. You have no idea how efficient people get. It's off the charts. Well, and if we all got our act together collectively and stopped making things worse, because that's another thing people do all the time, not only do they not do what they should to make things better, they actively attempt to make things worse because they're spiteful or resentful or arrogant or deceitful or homicidal or genocidal, or all of those things all bundled together in an absolutely pathological package. If people stopped really, really trying just to make things worse, we have no idea how much better they would get just because of that. So there's this weird dynamic that's part of the existential system of ideas between human vulnerability, social judgment, both of which are major causes of suffering, and the failure of individuals to adopt the responsibility that they know they should adopt. And that's the thing that's interesting too, is that, and like another thing I've often asked my undergraduate classes is, you know, there's this idea that people have a conscience. And you know what the conscience is. It's this feeling or voice you have in your head just before you do something that you know is stupid, telling you that probably you shouldn't do that stupid thing. You don't have to listen to it, strangely enough. But you go ahead and do it anyways, and then, of course, exactly what the conscience told you was going to happen inevitably happens, so that you feel even stupider about it than you would if it happened by accident. Because you know, I knew this was going to happen, I got a warning it was going to happen, and I went and did it anyways. And the funny thing, too, is that that conscience operates within people, and we really don't understand what the hell that is. So you might say, well, what would happen if you abided by your conscience for 5 years or for 10 years? What sort of position might you be in? What sort of family might you have? What sort of relationship might you be able to forge? And you can be bloody sure that a relationship that's forged on the basis of who you actually are is going to be a lot stronger and more welcome than one that's forged on the basis of who you aren't. Now, of course, that means that the person you're with has to deal with the full force of you in all your ability and your catastrophe, and that's a very, very difficult thing to negotiate. But if you do negotiate it, well, at least you have something, you have somewhere solid to stand, and you have somewhere to live, you have a real life. And it's a great basis upon which to bring children into the world, for example, because you can have an actual relationship with them instead of torturing them half to death, which is what happens in a tremendously large minority of cases. Well, it's more than that too, because, and this is what I'll close with, and this is why I wanted to introduce Solzhenitsyn's writings to you. You see, because it isn't merely that your fate depends on whether or not you get your act together and to what degree you decide that you're going to live out your own genuine being. It isn't only your fate, it's the fate of everyone that you're networked with. And so, you know, you think, well, there's 9 billion, 7 billion people in the world. We're going to peak at about 9 billion, by the way, and then it'll decline rapidly. But 7 billion people in the world, and who are you? You're just one little dust mote among that 7 billion. And so it really doesn't matter what you do or don't do, but that's simply not the case. It's the wrong model, because you're at the center of a network. You're a node in a network. Of course, that's even more true now that we have social media. You'll know 1,000 people, at least, over the course of your life. And they'll know 1,000 people each, and that puts you one person away from 1,000,000, and two persons away from 1,000,000,000. And so that's how you're connected. And the things you do, they're like dropping a stone in a pond. The ripples move outward, and they affect things in ways that you can't fully comprehend. And it means that the things that you do and that you don't do are far more important than you think. And so if you act that way, of course, the terror of realizing that is that it actually starts to matter what you do. And you might say, well, that's better than living a meaningless existence. It's better for it to matter. But I mean, if you really asked yourself, would you be so sure if you had the choice? I can live with no responsibility whatsoever. The price I pay is that nothing matters. Or I can reverse it and everything matters. But I have to take the responsibility that's associated with that. It's not so obvious to me that people would take the meaningful path. You know, when you say, well, nihilists suffer dreadfully because there's no meaning in their life and they still suffer. Yeah, but the advantage is they have no responsibility. So that's the payoff, and I actually think that's the motivation. Say, well, I can't help being nihilistic. All my belief systems have collapsed. It's like, yeah, maybe. Maybe you've just allowed them to collapse because it's a hell of a lot easier than acting them out. And the price you pay is some meaningless suffering, but you can always whine about that and people will feel sorry for you, and you have the option of taking the pathway of the martyr, so that's a pretty good deal, all things considered, especially when the alternative is to bear your burden properly and to live forthrightly in the world. Well, what Solzhenitsyn figured out, and so many people in the 20th century, it's not just him, even though he's the best example, is that if you live a pathological life, you pathologize your society. And if enough people do that, then it's hell. Really. Really. And you can read the Gulag Archipelago if you have the fortitude to do that, and you'll see exactly what hell is like. And then you can decide if that's a place you'd like to visit, or even more importantly, if it's a place you'd like to visit and take all your family and friends. Because that's what happened in the 20th century. I worked with this crazy psychologist. He used to put jokes on his multiple choice tests. He was a really eccentric guy, but I really liked his courses. He taught a course on creativity, and he was also a prison psychologist. And he was an eccentric guy, and he, for some reason, liked me, and maybe because I was eccentric too, and he invited me to go out to the Edmonton maximum security prison with him a couple of times, which I did, and that was a very interesting experience because I was trying to figure out what role each individual's behavior bore to the pathology of the group. It was something like that. And I went out there and I met a little guy, smaller than me. I was a little bigger by then. And he was a pretty innocuous guy. And what had happened was I was out in this gymnasium. It looks like a high school, a prison, which is really quite telling in my estimation. And there were all these like monsters in there weightlifting, and like they were monsters. I remember one guy who was tattooed everywhere, and he had like a huge scar running down the middle of his chest. It looked like someone had hit him with an axe, and and I was in there, and I had this weird cape that I used to wear that I bought in Portugal, and some boots that went along with it. And yeah, it was like an 1890s Sherlock Holmes cape, and it was really like it was from the 1890s because this little village was up on a hill. It was a walled city on a hill, and they sold these things, and I don't think they'd changed the style since 1890, and so I thought they were really cool, and so I was wearing that, which wasn't perhaps the most conservative garb to don if you're going to go to a maximum security prison. So anyways, I was in the gymnasium, and the psychologist left, and God only knows. I mean, that's what he was like. And all these guys came around me, and they were offering to trade their prison clothes for my cape, and it was it was like I was being made an offer I couldn't refuse, and so I didn't really know what to do. And then this little guy said something like that the psychologist sent me to come and take you away or something like that. And so I thought, well, better this little guy than all these monsters. So we went outside the gym through some doors, like school doors. We went outside the gym into the exercise yard, I guess, and we were wandering along, and he was talking to me, and he seemed like a kind of an innocuous guy. And then the psychologist showed up at the door and motioned us back, and so, which was kind of a relief. And so I went into his office, and he said, "You know that guy that you walked out in the yard with?" And I said, "Yeah." He said, he took 2 cops one night, and he had them kneel down, and while they were begging for their lives, he shot them both in the back of the head. And I thought, see, the thing that was so interesting was that he was so innocuous, right? Because what you'd hope is that someone like that would be very much unlike you, let's say, and certainly wouldn't be like someone innocuous that you'd met. What you'd want is that the guy would be like, half werewolf and half vampire, so you could just tell right away that he was a cold-blooded killer. But no, he was this sort of ineffectual little guy who was certainly not ineffectual if you gave him a revolver and the upper hand. And so that made me think a lot about the relationship between being innocuous and being dangerous. And then another thing happened. I met another guy out there, and then a week or two later I heard that he and a friend of his had held another guy down and pulverized his left leg with a lead pipe, like just pulverized it. And the reason for that was that they thought that he was a snitch, and maybe he was. And that time I did something different. Instead of being shocked and horrified by that, although I certainly was, I thought, how in the world could you do that? Because I didn't think I could do that. I thought that there was a qualitative distinction between me and those people. And so I spent about 2 weeks trying to see if I could figure out under what conditions I could do that. Like what kind of psychological transformation I would have to undergo to be able to do that. And so that was a meditative exercise, let's say. And it only took about 10 days for me to realize that not only could I do that, that it would be a hell of a lot easier than I thought it would be. And that's sort of where that wall between me and what Jung described as the shadow started to fall apart. And that also was very useful because I started to treat myself as a somewhat different entity because I hadn't been aware up to that point, because I thought I was a good guy. And there's no reason for me to think that, because you're not a good guy unless you've really made a bloody effort to be a good guy. You're just not. It's not easy. And so you're probably a moderately bad guy. And that's a long ways from being an absolutely horrible guy, but it's also a long ways from being a good guy. And so, but I had a little more respect for myself after that, because I also understood that there was a monstrous element to the human psyche that that you needed to respect. And that was part of you, that you should regard yourself in some sense as a loaded weapon. It's very useful around children to regard yourself as a loaded weapon, because around children you are a loaded weapon. And the terrible experiences that many children have with their parents are testament to that.